I have to comment on two of the announcements there. The Future of Ireland Commission, you'll hear me talk something about it. I'm going to the one that's in Philadelphia on October 30th. It represents the best hope I think we have for activating a lot more people on the issue of Ireland's unity than we've had in some time. It's made up of a composite of all strata of people in Ireland, 32 counties of Ireland, who are fed up waiting for the government to do something about preparing for unity and are seeking to get enough activation in America because they know the importance of America and raise funds for their continuing this tour they're making across the country. They're all good people that I've had to deal with. The other thing was a flashback to my old days. I started out in interest in Northern Ireland with the Hibernians, and I was the New York State FFAI chairman and the National FFAI chairman. And I can't stress enough, in the old days, the importance of raising funds for these groups was so understated. We finally got to the point where we were bringing the victims' families over, and have them give you a personal account of what was going on over there. That was what's most needed at that time. We were often thought of as, well, they're just the old regular IRA crowd. And then when you start talking to people, the mother of Caroline Kelly, for example, who was, Caroline Kelly was, I think she was 9 when she shot with a plastic bullet in the head and died. When you have eyewitness accounts, that's a much more convincing aspect to what were the message we had to send. And I think that still is important today. The funds that will be raised at any FFAI fundraiser will go to there's usually a roster of about 8 or 9 groups. One of those groups I'll mention in a minute. It's Paper Trail. It sounds like a funny kind of name, but it's a group that has been searching in documents that the British government has opened its files to at a certain level. And Paper Trail has got a number of people who are reading these documents, associating them with other information, and putting together evidence of certain transgressions of the British, to say the least. And they've survived largely on money that's been raised by the AOH and the FFAI program. They pick a project, they're very unique in that respect, and raise funds to try and tease out the truth and the facts about what's been going on over there, because that's so important. First of all, I just want to thank my host. He couldn't tell how long we've known one another, but I think it started somewhere in a beach in Rhode Island that we stumbled across one another back in the early days when I was with my family and he was with his. But we've managed to stay in touch and share the same sentiments over the many years. And I'm so glad he invited me to talk with you briefly. One of the things I'd like to mention, and I think it won't be a surprise, if I mention the name John Fogarty, Representative John Fogarty, does that rings a bell with somebody, right? Well, I don't think there's too many people who know about him. I sort of discovered him in resources one year, and then I was reacquainted with him in a book that was produced by a group here in Ireland about the Irish in Rhode Island. His effort was so close to bringing the Irish issue and reunification of Ireland to the forefront until the Department of State and all the ne'er-do-wells under the Washington administration at the time put him on a back burner, so to speak. And my interpretation of this over looking at all of the initiatives he took with resolutions that he introduced and the opposition that arose because of that, he came probably closest to anyone at that time to bringing the issue, an issue on our American agenda that we've long hoped for. And so I wanted to salute Mr. Fogarty and anybody who knows anything about him, and I wish more people did know something about him. A group that I have been instrumental in establishing, the ABC committee, has now been converted into a Google group. I don't know if, I said, look out in this audience, I don't know if you knew anything about a Google group. I didn't know anything about a Google group. But it's a way of putting your documents and the things you have to say and want people to give notice to, and link names to them, emails to them, so that when you add documents to it, it will alert the people on that list, in this case the ABC members, or anyone else that signs up, to the fact that a document has been added. When we organized the American Brexit Committee in the very beginning, it was a small bunch of activists. Jim, I think, was there for the first meeting, or at least a couple of meetings, which is no small thing for him to do from Rhode Island to New York City. But there were Hibernian representatives, IAUC, Irish Northern Aid, the Brehon Law Society, people that I had worked with over the years and knew that they would be interested in finding some response by Americans to Brexit and what the first victim of that Brexit move would be, and that would be Ireland and Northern Ireland. So from that 2016 to 2020, when Brexit finally kicked in for the British, there was a lot going on, and we were trying to raise issues, many of which the government here responded to in seeking some leverage from the British to do something about Northern Ireland and what was being corrupted in Northern Ireland, but on the Good Friday Agreement, I'll get to that in a minute. But so that's if you want to join up to the Google group, ABC Google group, I think you could probably figure out how you would get to it. It makes it a lot easier for older people like me, senior citizens like me, to get some information in people's hands and hopefully motivate them to be interested in whatever issues we're raising. And the same is true of the Irish American Unity Group, of which I was a board member for a number of years. They do a lot of good work. They too are supporting groups in Northern Ireland. It's not like the old days where there was a lot of persecution going on and a lot of family needs. This is how do I want to say this? This is the war in the long grass. And by that I mean one of the smart aleck British guys who knew he had been beaten in a visit by Jerry Adams with President Clinton up in Derry. He knew he had been beaten because it was covered by the press and the media, and it was just big news all over the place. The Northern Ireland mouse came over to him and says, "You may have beat us on this day, but we'll beat you in the long grass." This is the war we're waging in the long grass. It's things that British do best, not from the prying eyes of anyone other than the people that the ministers of misinformation, etc., will go about their business. The long grass has been a hall for us to try and battle. We were on street protests. We were raising money. We were raising consciousness. One person, I remember, was so upset by one of the TV stories about a prisoner and that was a prisoner of another country and so on. His cause was being promoted on a TV program. She called up the newspaper, not the newspaper, the TV station. She lived in New Jersey. She called them up and said, "Do you know anything about Joe Doherty? Can't you give Joe Doherty some coverage? His issue is much the same as this program that you had just finished. Well, that was the launch of a program on Joe Doherty. It was an NBC or CBS, one of the major stations, told his story, and he spent 5 or 6 years telling about Northern Ireland and his circumstances, but giving exposure to the issue that like had never been before. And just because one person decided that she'd been fed up listening to other stories of a similar ilk, but not hearing of our own. So, am I doing this with the phone? With this, all right?
Yeah,
All right.
talk at the top.
I think we can hear you fine without the mic.
Yeah. Well, all right. I won't hold it too close anyway. I just wanted to mention there is one handout. I don't know if you all have it in your hands at this point, but I hope you take it with you. It's called Portraits. I'm not going to talk a lot about it because I have other issues I want to raise, but you'll notice that there is a woman on there named Rosemary Nelson. Some of you may know of Rosemary Nelson's story. She was a lawyer in Lisburn, Northern Ireland, who was defending people involved in the conflict, either as protesters or IRA members and so on, but always defending them, as did Patrick Finucane before her. She was constantly harassed by the RUC, and saying constantly is not an exaggeration. She got the notion, and this is where it's important, she got the notion that Americans, I think, need to know this story. And Congressman Chris Smith in New Jersey wants to hear it. So when she was invited by him to testify to the Human Rights Commission, there's a specific name for it, escapes me. It was announced that she was going to go and attend and give testimony. Well, that's when things really began to heat up for her. She went there and testified, and it's wonderful testimony, real life testimony of a woman who had 3 children. Well, I can't get into it. I can't get into it because I can't speak. But she comes back, and within a month after coming back in 1999, her car blew up as she drove to work. That to me was a message that the loyalists and their handlers in the British government, the loyalists and their handlers in the British government wanted to say, America is not going to be inviting anybody over and ever again, and we'll show you why. So that part of the war hopefully is over, but it's a personal sacrifice, and the courage that she had and the confidence that she had in America responding to that, the circumstances in Northern Ireland. So, but there are others on that list. I think you may recognize the names. I don't want to go through them, but if you want to know, most of them I have. Thank you. Most of them I have either met or worked with or spoken to or read something they did, and they set an example for courage for me to, there was a time with Irish Northern Aid that I joked about it with my wife, but only half jokingly, that I would look under the car at the time in the driveway before I drove out in the morning, because that was, if you were Irish Northern Aid, you had reason to be targeted by the British, but they were usually very good about not targeting Americans in America. There was one guy in the Bronx who went back and they got him in the back, as they did get Rosemary Nelson. I can't somehow miss that thing. Yeah, there was another handout that I would like you to think about because it's very appropriate to what we're experiencing. It's what would you do? For a brief period in time in 1971 to 1974, there was killings of Catholics, internment of Catholics, and bombing of Catholics and almost anybody who they could bomb in that time period. And in that relatively short time period was the ignition, the instigation of the armed struggle that resumed. Widgery made a mockery of the people that died in Bloody Sunday. The Dublin Monaghan bombings were aimed at 2 shopping centers in Ireland. They couldn't kill anybody of a military service. They chose shoppers and children in those 2 bombs. The Omagh bombing at the end of the struggle was another situation I'll address later on. But it's just the piece that I handed out is just an attempt to think, if you were living in Northern Ireland, if you were under that sort of system, if those types of things happened to you, internment and bombings and so on and so forth, what would you do in those circumstances? And I use that because there's a lot of people, Jim and I and others, had to put up with, who thought, well, you must be gun runners or bombers or whatever, you're just IRA types. Well, as it turns out, we might not have been to begin with, but we certainly were by the end. So I think any human being had to go through that stuff, particularly at that time period. They had suffered 50 years of discrimination in Catholic unemployment, so they had perfected this system. So once you put those things in together in a very relatively short period of time, the armed struggle was inevitable. And I'm sure there are people at MI5 who are saying, gloriously, we've got the destabilization thing we need for the next 30 years. And they did get it. It was a conflict, an armed conflict that I think was probably a necessary part of the whole process unfolded, but that's the story of another day. And I do hope at some point we'll get to some questions that you might have. I wanted to have some things handed out, scribble some questions on anything I say or anything you have on your mind, and I'm happy to try and answer them for you. There's two basic elements of modern Irish history, Northern Ireland history, that I want to talk about. I think a lot of you are familiar enough with the history of the conflict, at least in general terms, and what that entailed. But talking about post-1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, there would never have been a Good Friday Agreement if it wasn't for the United States and if it wasn't for people like you. Bill Clinton had some idea of what Northern Ireland is about. He was a student over at Oxford at the time, but as a student. And he was familiar with the issues at the time. But it wasn't until a guy that I worked with for, John Deary, in New York, he was a state legislator, that he began to be interested in it. And when it came to having a debate, presidential debate, he wanted to be prepared for that question when it came up, and he came up with a good answer. He wanted to support the McBride Fair Employment Principles, and he wanted to issue a visa to Jerry Adams, and he did. He was very supportive on both points. So, and it was, as I want to emphasize, it was a lot of little people around the country, myself included, who had no expectation that the President of the United States was going to tap a esteemed member of the Senate, and George Mitchell showed how serious he was about getting this Good Friday Agreement passed. So that is the first stage in a long process that has been unfolding. Unfortunately, that unfolding process has consisted of a lot of broken agreements by the British. It's 27 years, 4 inked agreements that I'm aware of. There were 2 that I'll just mention briefly. One, the St. Andrews Agreement, had some obligations that the British were going to undertake, or think they were going to undertake. It wasn't until it was inked and then came the printed copies of the agreement came out that the British had, lo and behold, added a codicil that MI5 people will be stationed in every police barracks in Northern Ireland. Now, that happens to have been totally contradictory to the Patton report. Now, Chris Patton was the guy who was supposed to study the police in Northern Ireland and came up with a host of recommendations, one of which is don't put any MI5 people in any police barracks. Such was the way with the conservatives at the time, and still is, that they wanted to have their person, an MI5 person in each barracks. That unfolded without further ado, and I think there's probably MI5 still stationed there, or they might not make much of a fuss of it. The other agreement worth noting is the Stormont House Agreement. It was negotiated at a time when there was an ombudsman as part of the previous agreements. Now, an ombudsman was supposed to review cases of the police involvement in arrests and so on and so forth. And there would be a review of the case, and if there was charges that would be brought or issues that would be raised, the ombudsman would do that. And there was also some other voices that are being heard at that time. Well, as it turns out, that was the beginning of the discovery of all of these cases that had never been investigated in the first place. The killings never investigated in the first place. That happens to be against the European Code of Human Rights, but apparently nobody was going to bother with it in Northern Ireland. The British government certainly wasn't going to bother with it. And the Stormont House Agreement was short on a lot of inquests that were being held at the time, but had to be adjourned because the government, or the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, was not providing information that the coroner wanted for his inquest as to the cause of death. So while that's going on, somebody in MI5 and the Whitehall Monument said, you know, this is going to get out of control. They're all going to see how we didn't investigate the crimes for the things that we knew we had an involvement with. A lot of people who had lost loved ones that were killings, the police would say, oh yes, we're taking some information and we'll call you if we have any more information. Never bothered to call. It was a tactic they used incessantly. But what a lot of people didn't notice at the time, and I had first heard of, in 1978, I think, or 79, the rules for coroner's inquest were changed. And this is just another notch in the system of oppression that they were working with. They were changed so that you didn't have to have a jury, you couldn't have a jury in the coroner's inquest, and you couldn't find a verdict of cause of death. Now, with those two switches, they didn't have any worry about coming up with the wrong answer about a government assassination and so on and so forth. So the Stormont House Agreement, as soon as that information started to come out, the ombudsman report started to come out, the Stormont House Agreement collapsed and literally folded it under its own weight. The other aspect, the piece of the legacy, piece of GFA, at the same time the GFA was passed in 1998, they passed the Human Rights Act, 1998 Human Rights Act. It mirrors the European Convention on Human Rights. That today, by the conservatives, the Kim Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, repeated again what some of them had previously repeated. We want the repeal of the European Convention on Human Rights. Why would you want to repeal something as harmless as the European Convention on Human Rights unless you had something to hide? And they are so consistently asking for the repeal of that. If they ever get back in power, they may get it. But it's something that almost everybody in Ireland is opposed to, understandably. I mean, that it gives rise to the issue that I'm going to mention next. When the Conservatives were just about getting out of power in December of 24, they wanted to get through the legacy and Reconciliation Act of Northern Ireland. The purpose of the bill was just to cover up all of the crimes, particularly 1,100 deaths that had neither been investigated fully or never investigated at all, and had, what was the other element of the, had to have a coroner's inquest adjourned because the Ministry of Defense would not provide the information. They didn't stop the inquest, but they adjourned it. So this baggage of British rule is represented in those 1,100 killings. And now there is a commission in Northern Ireland called the Commission of Information Recovery and whatever. It's another ICCIRIR. Recovery and whatever it is. There's so many damn commissions that they created a drop of a hat. Anyway, a chairman of that commission, Sir Declan Morgan, said recently in a article about the Legacy Act and its problems and the repeal they want to make of it, but haven't done so yet, is that where the government has some vetoes and consistently uses vetoes to provide, to block anyone for information, maybe we could give them something like, and I love this, something like the gist of it, of what they want to hold back. Now, I'm surprised I think he's a lawyer. I want to hear or see any lawyer or any judge in this country that wants to go on the basis of the gist of something rather than truth and fact. So the gist, he thinks, would be, well, it certainly appears as though the government was involved. I mean, they did this and they did that, and there's this evidence that was suppressed, and then the building burned down because there was a loss of evidence. So all those factors pulled together, you might infer that the government was about it, but we're not going to say we did it. And the principal concern there is they don't want to have to pay anything for any way of compensation for their lawlessness. There's no other way to describe it. Their lawlessness and their murderous ways. There's 1,100 deaths that wasn't Morgan, but it was somebody else cited. The progress to date involves 200 people have approached with information to this commission. 90 have instigated instigated investigations, and there are, those involve 170 deaths. Well, that's a good start. It's a good start, but it's a long way from the 1,100. They would rather see never get an inquest, never get investigated. So the British are basically saying they don't want to give any information, and if it isn't for people like you and some of the congressmen and some of the people we had in office insisting that there's an investigative obligation by the European Convention of Human Relations, then that's what they're going to get. That, incidentally, is one of the things that moved us into Brexit. Brexit came about for the public relations reasons for Brexit, is that, well, those cockamamie refugees, they're coming from everywhere. We can't have people like that. And the regulations, we can't do it. Regulations, here's the biggest bureaucracy for a time in the empire. We can't have regulations. They prospered for 50 years as a member of the European Union. What they now knew was facing them is how to explain Northern Ireland, how to explain the killings and so on. And I was just telling Jim, the phrase that comes to mind and is the phrase I will be continually using is state sponsor of terrorism. It's a code name in the United Nations, it's a code name in other international law. What the state sponsor of terrorism, how you get that label, and everything the British have done in Northern Ireland qualifies for a state sponsor of terrorism. So Brexit was supposed to kind of get us out from under the European Convention and any entitlement they were for things like a complete investigation of their crime. Now, that certainly was part of the issue. The other part was that if we can just get out of the European Union's regulatory framework, there's other ways we can address certain issues. And that was one of the follow-ups. I think it's some literature that I sent there. It was a story by a Max Colchester. He's a Wall Street Journal journalist who described the various aspects of Brexit's impact on Britain since 2020. Now, it's my contention, I think it's pretty obvious, it's the contention of a lot of people, that, and here was the key, the British government was normally producing command papers. They call command papers because Her Majesty or His Majesty commands the paper be produced. Excuse me, but it's called a command paper. There would be a command paper produced for every major initiative in Britain, in economic initiative, legal initiative, command papers that would address issues that affected the whole country and were a way of introducing the debate. Not uncommon to have it. Now, if you're going to exit the European Union, which you've been in for 50 years, it's a significant sort of issue that someone would have to get into some detail. They didn't do it. They haven't done it before, and they haven't done it since, because they knew all along. They knew all along there was going to be a disaster economically, and has proven to be a disaster. So the command paper was the signal that they weren't serious about that. There's Colchester's remarks involve other estimates of the amount. Almost 100,000 people in the civil service had to be added to the civil service to undo all of the regulations of the European Union that were in the laws of England. So it wasn't too well thought out, or it was thought out very well, but for a different purpose than people subsequently thought. In fact, the funniest piece is a guy and a whole bunch of people in the town of Boston, if you will, in England, that had 70% of the people voted for Brexit. 3 years later, they were all ready to string up the politicians that were advocating for Brexit. It's impacted every economic element in the village of Boston. And in fact, is for all of those, the people that do all the work that nobody else wants to do, they were now begging for these people. They want more of these people. They can't, if they can't be both people, they got to get some people in who are willing to do these jobs that, in our case, are working in the fields, fruit picking and whatever. So it was a nice try to cover the crimes that they were trying to cover the crimes they committed by going through this Brexit issue. Okay. One of the things I want to just mention briefly, because it's part of the things I want to leave you with, is the Irish conflict has always been a foreign policy issue. A lot of people who have Irish heritage in their blood, think of Ireland as part of the family and so on, and if they hurt, we hurt sort of thing. But government at its highest levels in foreign policy sees a different picture. And that's why what we have to do going forward is address the issue from targeted efforts. And by targeted efforts, I mean a lot of good work was done writing letters to members of Congress, the local members of Congress, and so on and so forth. And some of that actually produced some new followers of the issue. But foreign policy is going to be conducted on a higher level, and usually in the Congress it starts with the leaders and the chairmen of the key committees. Foreign Relations in the Senate and Foreign Affairs in the House. We have had great work from the chairman of House Foreign Affairs for us over the past years until the leadership changed in the House. But it's most of the people who come into office, whether it's the Senate or the House, they start their issues and take their directions from the leaders. The central office of both houses produce these reports. The documents that we should have been giving them for many years have never reached these people, and they've got to be brought to the forefront of the people in the staff of the foreign committees, Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Relations Committee. One day I was talking to a fellow named Joe Leleveld of the New York Times and complaining about not getting enough exposure to the issue. He was the foreign affairs editor at the time. And he opened up his desk drawer, the side desk drawer, and showed it was full of reports and studies and issues that the Jewish lobby had taken and brought in on a weekly and monthly basis. And not that it did much good lately, but anyway, the point was, I don't know that anybody was doing that at the time. It's certainly something that should be done in the future in the long grass. And in the long grass, I've explained to you what that means. Somebody has to go, like I did, and I had a position, so I maybe got a little farther, but ask for an invitation, sit down with a reporter, a journalist, share with them a document, share them things like Ireland's future. This is the document's been produced by one of the events that Jim spoke about earlier, and Leo Varadkar, former minister of Ireland, and Taoiseach, I think at some point, gave a wonderful speech. It's at that level, the intelligentsia, if you will, of Ireland, putting together a proposition, a program, issues that have to be discussed, giving things like that to a Joe Leleveld at the time, or to people who are in a position to do the journalistic work that they would do, which happens to be a lot easier now because of the internet, I think gives us a leg up. Because we have people who can do that, and it doesn't. The other thing that is, and I'm not familiar with it, but I do know that while I was worried about speaking to people in the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal and New York Times, there were other people out there 20 years younger than me, 30 years younger than me, who were working the net and working the digital age. They were putting documents online and videos online that I had no way of how to do it, and I don't know if many people who did, but now is the time for this work in the long grass to be able to share information. I only know that because sometimes I would put something on my website, my wife and I, our website, Facebook I should say. And I'll get commentary from people I've never heard of, and I don't know, in AI, I don't know if it's true or not, but these people seem very concerned with the issue I raised. They want more information, bada bing. So I think there's a venue for getting information in the hands of people who want to get information into. Now, we're faced with one big problem, and that's that the current executive and Congress are in the hands of Republicans who have a whole different agenda, and if anything, they have an agenda that is looking the other way. So when we had Speaker Pelosi, we still had Chuck Schumer, but we had Joe Biden. That made a difference, and I think the reason we made a difference in a couple of areas was because of those three. I mentioned specifically just before they went out of office, the Department of Secretary of State sent a démarche, it's a fancy French word for a warning, to the British government, who were planning to remove themselves from the European Convention of Human Rights. And funny enough, as soon as that was done, the British government retracted their effort to remove themselves from the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, that was something everybody in Ireland wanted Britain not to do it. They were going to do it, and yet our Department of State issued that démarche, and the issue was the British took note. So there were some good things happening out there. It's going to be harder to do these things. They're trying to get the issue, but the midterms may change some of the characters involved, but it's still going to require some work, and there's much work to be done. One of the issues I'll just mention in closing is that the British, good people that they are, the good British people are good. My ancestors going way back were from Chester, England, and my wife's parents were living in England for a long time, but they are very interested in producing a history of the conflict. Somebody said to me, well, I thought the history of the conflict is what they're writing already. They want to write a different history of the conflict, one that's a little more sanitized than what they've had to show for us so far. So they've put out a bidding of some sort. Five historians that have been chosen. The first bump they hit in discussing what they're going to be able to do, or their rules for writing this history, how we deal with documents that the Ministry of Defense won't give us, and how can that be addressed? And there was some discussion just, I think, in the last couple of months amongst themselves. One historian said, if I can't have the documents unredacted, then I'm not going to be a part of it, because it'll just be the same story told by different people. So in the campus atmosphere, for example, you could invite a speaker on that issue, and there will be people who will take up that issue. When you write an official history, how do you write it from the conqueror's standpoint, which is often said? Or in this case, considering the fact that the British are right in the middle of trying to bury 1,100 killings because of their state-sponsored terrorism, what could be asked of these historians that might be against every rule or ethic they have? So that issue, I think that issue would appeal to members of a history department or people in a law environment. It's some of those edges around the long grass that we could keep this issue alive in America long enough maybe to have some different changes, and maybe we actually might get an Irish government that has some spine. I mean, when I remember Speaker O'Neill in Congress saying to an assembled it was more people that's in this room, but when an assembled of activists came down to Washington, at the end of a presentation by Mario Biaggi, and there was a speaker, someone asked a question. His answer was very poignant because it was frustrating for him. What do you want me to do? Be more Irish than the Irish government? It's a good question. We have to have, this guy is the first guy that actually has done something for the Irish government. He's the one who put the backstop together that saved them from Brexit. And he's over here now trying to convince Americans, we've got to get this unity poll and this unity vote up so we can get some people in the Irish government who have some spine. No, he didn't say it quite like that, but that's the way I'm saying it. I said a lot, I've talked too much, I'm a little dry, I had water here someplace. Can I answer any questions? Or have I bored you to tears? Anyway, I'm almost as broadly based as Jim suggested, but at this stage, coming on 80, I have memory loss too. So yes.
Are there any honest brokers in Whitehall that you know of? That...
Yeah, very, very good question. How do I want to say it? And his name came up recently in this Israel fiasco, Gaza fiasco. Blair, when he was prime minister, had a couple of people, one of whose name I forget, who was very knowledgeable about. He had been like in the bureaucracy of Whitehall. Another thing, if you don't know, you should appreciate, because it's drilled in our minds that when we're little about the British government gave us the rule of law and democracy, and that's baloney. Parliament is the executive and the legislative side of government. And up until 2008, there wasn't even a Supreme Court. So 2008, they broke off and created the Supreme Court. So it's a totally different government where the bureaucracy really runs things. And people, if you ever, I suggest you get the videos if you can. Yes Minister programs are just a perfect caricature of the government where the ministers come and go, but the bureaucrats are there forever. So there were a couple of guys on, his name, did I say it escaped me?
Tony Blair.
In Tony Blair's administration, who, in addition to being knowledgeable, actually, and then one was a woman, what was her name? She was going through cancer therapy, and
Oh, yeah.
wonderful woman, very, very down to earth. She was in a cabinet meeting of some sort, and her head was itchy. She took her wig off and was scratching her head. And some of the ne'er-do-wells at the cabinet were shocked that she did that. But she was very down to earth. Didn't always agree with what's being promoted, but she had the engaging aspect, which many do not in the British government. Here's a beauty. Priti Patel, what a name, Pakistani, I think. Priti Patel was the Secretary of State of England. In the course of Brexit negotiations, and I remember Brexit was something that the British really wanted Ireland to join them. And thankfully some calmer heads prevailed. But Brexit was they wanted Ireland to join in the Brexit escape from the EU. So Priti Patel, as Secretary of State, said, I know, if they don't want to come, maybe we'll shut off their food supplies. Now, he's talking to a country that was starved to death in 1845 to 1850, and she has the gall to say such a thing and thought it was going to be somehow productive to what she wanted. Priti Patel, remember that name. Now, Kim Badenoch is not much better, the current leader of the Conservative Party, who couldn't remember that Northern Ireland voted against going into Brexit. She said in a press conference about 2 weeks ago, no, Northern Ireland voted to be join Brexit. So that's a roundabout way of saying, I think there's some potential there for people, but they haven't percolated to the top, and I'm kind of hoping this election, or maybe this presidential race in Ireland, will produce somebody. if they just, even some younger generations of people, the Irish Taoiseach and the Taoiseach are there forever. Now, Simon Harris hasn't been, but certainly, what's his name has. And there isn't enough turbulence in the body to create some friction and get some issues addressed. It's basically chums. Chums, the women and the men are chums. It's a small country. You know, that's why England has been very good about bullying. I mean, it's a small country. And Sean McBride said several times there was too many people in government who were, he assumed and said they were spies and been on the British payroll for years, but they have this slave mentality. You know, they're waiting to do whatever the master wants. So that will come too with time. You would think it'd be by now, but such is the way of politics roaring nowadays. But I have hope that we have people in this country, particularly now that some of the people that were supportive of us are out of power. I mean, they're in the minority. And I worked for the minority legislature in the state of New York for 10, 15 years. They become more bolder to speak on something when they don't have the majority, because they can say things that might be, they wouldn't say otherwise, but because they don't have the power to implement it, they're willing to take a chance that that issue needs addressing, and I'd be glad to speak on its behalf or something like that. So, but I think that sort of thing would be helpful. And I think, truth be told, and I think you can tell it from the handout, the more women we get in the doll, the more we will get that kind of friction and some discussion of a serious nature. Yes. Anyway,
I just had a quick question. Just you had brought it up, made my wheels turn. Catherine Connolly, if she became president of Ireland, do you think that, like, I don't know that much about the presidency and how much power they have. Do you think that, I know she stands for unity, and the other woman's name, I can't think of her name that's running, the two candidates that are running. But anyway, do you think Kathleen Connolly will be able to have the power as president of Ireland to break the FEMA foil?
She has a very good power, very important power that hasn't been exercised by Higgins, who is a very good man, very good on unity, and a historian bar none. Very deliberate on all the things he said. He was at every memorial that was ever held for the revolution and the rebellion and so on. And he actually would get into trouble occasionally because his views differed from the current party. But Catherine Connolly is likely to be, I hope, in the person of who's the other two previous women who were president of Ireland?
Mary Robinson.
Mary Robinson.
And Mary McAleese.
McAleese, yes, Mary McAleese. She's from the north. And Mary Robinson is from near the north, I think, too. But that, well, she had the propinquity too. And I don't know about I don't know much about Catherine Connolly. I do know that she was endorsed by Sinn Féin, which means that she would at least not diminish what had already been said by Higgins about the importance of unity and actually the government actually preparing for it. Now, she might have different ways of saying it, and if she's clever as McAleese and Robinson were, she could do that. And Higgins was, well, he was old, but he was also slightly infirm. So I imagine Catherine Connolly is going to get around more and be an advocate. And if she's ever an advocate over here, and that's where I really think that it makes a difference, or an advocate in the United Nations and so on, yeah, she'll definitely make a difference. She doesn't have any power, but she's got the power of the pulpit. And if she uses it carefully, she could have a great impact at a time it's needed. Yes?
How much power now does the British monarchy itself actually have in all this? Any, or are they kind of?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking of that because you may have heard that King Charles is going to be praying with Pope Leo in the Vatican as something that hasn't been done for 500 years, and it's always good when people pray. I'm all for that. But I often think back on Elizabeth II, how many times she had the ability and nobody could shut her up if she didn't want to be shut up, the ability to, even in the quiet chambers of Whitehall, this is nuts, you can't keep doing this. Internment, assassination campaigns of elected officials, plastic bullets. She had opportunities to do that, and as far as I know, never did. So the monarchy is a symbol. If we ever got a king or a queen who could stretch that symbolic aspect of it, I think that would be favorable. It just hasn't happened in recent years. I don't think Charles will do anything more than what he might be doing in terms of this meeting. Yes?
So the new Prime Minister, Stormer, where does he stand on this, change of government and all?
Yeah, good question. I was just thinking about this today because it was said that Trump insulted him. I think it was at something. And I don't recall reading the full article about it, but it was one of those things that, and Trump apparently, Starmer just ignored him or something, but our president, unfortunately, could use a good course in manners. But Starmer, all the while that Brexit was being promoted, a good chunk of his members thought Brexit was a good idea, as he walked a tightrope. And the one thing he has promised, and still hasn't done, although it's long overdue, he promised the repeal of the legacy law, lock, stock, and barrel. No tinkering with it or anything else, lock, stock, and barrel. That hasn't been done, which makes me suspicious. The nature of the parliamentary government, as I described it, the club includes a lot of people who are manipulated slowly amongst small majorities, and so they're always trying to placate one another. One knows it's going out of office, so will do something. The other one just chums back in. It's possible that he could bring some. He had a human rights background in his legal career, so I know he is against the repeal of the Human Rights Act of 1998, which is a good thing, and he should be credited with that. And hopefully, it never will be done. But how much more he's willing to do on that, because if he were to say, and this is totally plausible, well, the Good Friday Agreement has provisions that if a poll was taken and a vote was to be made, I'd want to be prepared. If I were England, I'd want to be prepared for the transfer of the 6 counties to the Republic, and do so in a manner that's seamless and no crazy calamity of any sort. He hasn't said such a thing, so he's like putting it on the long finger as much as he can. It's one of those things, anything for the quiet life. I don't want to have to let somebody down the road do it. But the Irish government and the English government have done that sort of, well, maybe in 2030 we'll have a vote. The Taoiseach of Ireland said, well, we've got to wait till there's some reconciliation. Now, you would expect that from this guy who's been in and out of Irish politics as Taoiseach and so on. He wants the quiet life, certainly not preparing for anything that's going to require some decision-making and political handshaking and so on. So you're not gonna get much out of him. I don't know the next government in Ireland, I think, is due in 2 years, where the vote will be in 2 years. So maybe if there's a significant change there, but Starmer, if he sticks to human rights, and if he sticks to acknowledging, as many of the prime ministers have said since 1998, it's got to be supportive of the Good Friday Agreement, that's a start. And it's a start that all of you here and anyone else who wasn't, I know some of you people are on the American Brexit Committee, and I know because there were some names that I had to make sure I had the addresses correct and everything, and the emails correct, have been on that committee. It was a committee of 300 people, many of whom I worked with, but many others who we just wanted them to commit. No, there's no dues, no meetings. We wanted you to commit your name to something that was going to be going on about Brexit and could be harming Ireland. And that has taken hold because of people like you and others. So, I'm very grateful for that. Any other questions? I mean, you can ask me questions when I come down from here, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So would you say that the problem in Ireland is just status quo, inertia, not wanting to rock the boat because they're so successful now?
Yeah, there's an economic overlay to this that I'm glad you addressed it. It's that there's the American government or the United Nations and a number of the EU, I think, has taken up a tax proposal dealing with multinationals and where they pay taxes and how they pay taxes. And this is a long way around of explaining that because of Ireland's economy being built a lot on these mailbox offices, corporate headquarters in Ireland for major corporations like Microsoft, they have billions in income that are not currently being taxed or taxed mightily because it's such a low tax rate there compared to other jurisdictions. I'm only saying that because the EU is breathing down Ireland's neck on the same point, and Ireland will do whatever the EU wants, but it has certain economic repercussions. But that shouldn't. When Ireland fell apart, geez, I'm losing my grip. When Germany fell apart, one leader said, "We're going to be united again." And although it wasn't pretty and it wasn't the way everybody wanted it to be, it works, and it works now more than it ever would have worked in the past. And how much smaller is Ireland to that problem? So we're supposed to be in the mindset. McBride said it more than I ever said it, Dr. McBride. If you have the media behind you saying the same thing over and over again, Ireland's a small country, or Britain is our friend. If they say it over and over enough again, you're reluctant to do this or do that. It would take a bold step, you're right, to just say, look, the vote. I mean, I wrote something for one of the former legislators that I worked with, said, forget the poll. Just do what you should have done back in 1918. Instead of carving it up before you ever gave it back to the Irish people, just say, it's yours. We'll do the math, and let's get this off your agenda, where there's so many other important issues in this world today, besides Ireland's petty problems. But it's it's a barnacle on the body politic in this world, one which I'm not going to see the fruits of it, but I think doing this a little bit here and elsewhere, or writing that I do, or sharing information with people, that day will come, and I'm sure some of you here will see that. Thank you very much.